what underlies the numerical ability of ants or birds or fish also underpins our own numerical ability. My guess is that no Greek, no ancient Roman was a prodigious calculator because their notation was inappropriate for calculation. Self-recognition is difficult. When you can't do what everybody else in the class can do, you think of yourself as being stupid. And I've had lots of adults come to me late in life, even in their 80s, and say, at last I understand why I couldn't learn arithmetic. It's not because I was stupid.
This is Brain Inspired.
Hey, it's Paul. My guest today is Brian Butterworth. Brian is Emeritus Professor of Cognitive Neuropsychology at University College London. He's written previous books like The Mathematical Brain and Dyscalculia, and his newest book, Can Fish Count? What Animals Reveal About Our Uniquely Mathematical Minds, which is the main subject of our conversation today. The book, like the subtitle suggests, explores the counting and numerical abilities of many species, why it's important for organisms to count, how evolution has shaped what's important to count for individual species, the experiments to test counting abilities, how our brains might implement our numerical abilities, and other related topics. Today we discuss dyscalculia for a while and its relation to dyslexia, something Brian knows a lot about. Then we wander through a few of the topics I just mentioned, using examples like fish, lions, birds, and bees, and a handful of others, although the book has many more examples than we get to. So I linked to the book in the show notes at braininspired.co/podcast/137. If you like the topics discussed in general on this podcast and want to learn more about the intersection of neuroscience and AI, you may be interested in my free video series, Open Questions in AI and Neuroscience. In it, you'll learn about some key unanswered questions in both fields and the emerging field of neuro-AI, which can help move those fields forward. Go to braininspired.co/open to get those videos. All right, here's my discussion with Brian Butterworth. So, Brian, the book is called Can Fish Count? But really it's about the counting and numerical abilities of many species. It's a broad survey of which animals and organisms can count and how we tell how they can count, whether they can count. And of course, it's about, the mechanisms of counting and so on. First of all, why are you interested in counting and why fish in particular?
Well, like much of science, it's down to luck. So it was by luck I became a neuropsychologist. I was just a regular psycholinguist. Then I got called in to do some analysis of aphasic patients. And so I actually became quite well known for doing research on aphasia. Then I had a pipeline to a university in Italy, the University of Padua, and under the European Community, as it was then, I would send them students and they would send me students. And one of the students who came to work with me for her PhD initially wanted to work on aphasia because that's what I did. And when she got to London, she said, I don't want to work on aphasia. I want to work on something that nobody else works on, or very few people work on. And so I looked into my past and discovered I was interested in the foundations of mathematics. And I thought, well, why don't we look at mathematical abilities? And so we did a series of individual patient studies who had selective deficits initially of their mathematical abilities, where previously they'd been okay at maths. And we also did a few patients who had preserved mathematical abilities when other cognitive abilities like memory and language were all shot to pieces. And what we discovered, or perhaps I should say rediscovered, was that there was a particular part of the brain, in the left parietal lobe, which, if damaged, led to difficulties with mathematics, and if intact, led to preserved mathematics, even though other parts of the brain might affect language and memory and so on. And then I started to ask why this part of the brain, and that's really the beginning of the story about how I got to fish.
Ah, okay. So you're talking about dyscalculia. Dyscalculia?
Yes, dyscalculia. Yeah, that came a little bit later. One of the themes in neuropsychology back in the 90s was whether dissociations that you found in patients could be found developmentally. So a range of different disabilities in reading or language had been identified in neurological patients. And the question is, could some kind of developmental disorder lead to a similar kind of pattern? So I wondered if this was the case with numerical abilities. If, for example, children have something anomalous about their left parietal lobe, would this lead to them having problems with, at least with numerical tasks? And that's why I started thinking about developmental dyscalculia. And I think we were the first, actually, to discover that children, in this case they were 9 years old, who were really bad at very, very simple tasks, like saying how many dots there are in a display where there are only 1 to 10 dots. These were the kids who had real trouble doing arithmetic. And since that original study, which I did with a brilliant visiting scientist from Austria called Karen Landau, and an equally brilliant student of mine called Anna Bevan, that was really the start of, I would say, modern investigations into developmental dyscalculia. We showed that if you're bad at enumerating dots, then you're going to have trouble learning arithmetic. And so we began to think that maybe there's some kind of innate system for doing very simple number tasks, for extracting numerical information from the environment, and that if, like other inherited capacities, something goes wrong in the course of inheritance, then you could end up having trouble with things that other people found perfectly easy.
Well, you make the point. I want to ask about the relation to language in a moment, but you make the point that dyslexia is widely recognized and treated. And in fact, I don't know if it was just underdiagnosed when I was younger, but it seems like half of the children that my kids go to school with have been diagnosed with dyslexia and are getting treatment for that. But you have made the point that dyscalculia is under-recognized and under-treated.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. There was a major UK government report published in 2008 which compared the effects on life chances of dyscalculia and dyslexia. And what they found was that in terms both of lifetime's earnings and in terms of educational opportunities, having dyscalculia was more of a handicap than dyslexia. Now, why dyslexia should be better recognized than dyscalculia is a deep historical problem. I think one of the reasons is because it seems to be okay to say to a friend or a teacher, or a parent, I'm just not very good at maths. But you can't really say, well, I'm not very good at reading, or I'm not very good at, hearing language.
Then you're dumb, right?
That's the cause of most dyslexias. And the other thing, there was a wonderful English actress called Susan Hampshire, who many years ago collected famous people who were dyslexic. She herself, as an actress, was dyslexic and found it very, very hard to learn her lines. And she wondered if there were other people who were somehow made it in their own world who were also dyslexic. So, for example, racing driver Jackie Stewart was one of those who was who came out, if you will, as dyslexic. We had a deputy prime minister, Michael Heseltine, who nearly became prime minister. Unfortunately, he didn't. And he admitted to being dyslexic. And there are many of them. So in our current parliament, there are quite a few people who admit to being dyslexic, but none so far who admit to being dyscalculic.
Well,
but I've put out a request. Any of you famous people who are dyscalculic or think you might be dyscalculic, please come forward and we'll test you.
Think you might be is the key there. Yeah, because I'm curious, when people are dyslexic and or dyscalculic, how easy it is to self-recognize that.
Self-recognition is difficult, as it was for dyslexia originally. When you can't do what everybody else in the class can do, you think of yourself as being stupid. And I've had lots of adults come to me late in life, even in their 80s, and say, at last I understand why I couldn't learn arithmetic. It's not because I was stupid. I thought, all this time I thought I was just stupid because I couldn't do arithmetic. And now I know that, it could be something quite specific, nothing to do with stupidity at all. I mean, it's a bit like colourblindness, isn't it, Professor Butterworth? Some people are colourblind, some people aren't, and it's nothing to do with their intelligence. It's just that something's gone wrong with the inheritance. So I feel that being able to identify it relieves people of the burden of thinking they're just stupid.
Yeah. This is a total aside, but I was thinking so just going back to dyslexia again, I don't know that there's as much of a stigma now to dyslexia. And in fact, it seems like at least a portion of the population, like some mental phenomena, dyslexia is almost kind of like celebrated as something special now. Do you have that sense, or am I misreading society in that regard?
No, that's absolutely right. I mean, I've even got a book somewhere called The Gift of Dyslexia.
Right, okay.
Which says, well, dyslexics just think differently, and this can be very, very creative. I don't know there have been any proper studies, peer-reviewed studies, of whether dyslexics are more creative than non-dyslexics. So, I'm agnostic about that. But of course, dyslexia is a serious problem, and unless you get the right sort of help early on, you're never going to be able to read efficiently. And if you do get the right help early on, then you can learn to read efficiently. You won't necessarily read in the same way as non-dyslexics, but you can get by. In fact, the first dyslexic that we ever tested, a young woman who was in my seminar group at University College London, which, by the way, is an extremely hard university to get into. You have to be really good to get into it. And so all the students there are really good. And, she was reading out her essay one day in the seminar group. And every time, I think it was an essay on neurotransmitters. So these are words that you come across in text, but you don't often hear spoken. And also by authors that you see in text but don't hear spoken. So she read out a perfectly good essay on neurotransmitters, and every time she came to the name of a neurotransmitter or an author she wanted to cite, she turned to the student next to her and said, how do you say that? And he would say, whatever it was, GABA, for example, something really simple. And next time she came across GABA, she would say GABA. So each word that she knew how to pronounce, she had to learn as a separate item.
Interesting.
So to get to the psychology course at University College, she had to do a lot of very, very hard work. So she had to learn all those words separately. And we tested her formally after this. Oh, this is interesting. And so we gave her really simple letter strings that she'd never seen before and asked her to pronounce them, and she couldn't. But once we told her how to pronounce them, she was okay. And that was a particular, rather specialized case of dyslexia. I mean, there are cases like that, and there are cases which are rather different from that. But she formed a pattern, and we thought that this was actually worth letting the world know about, and we wrote some papers about it. And curiously, we found a Japanese boy. We didn't find him. His father found us. And this Japanese boy was exactly like this student of mine, in that he was really, really bad at reading English. Mm-hmm. He could only pronounce words whose pronunciation he already knew. But his Japanese reading was very superior. So we thought this was a very interesting observation, and we actually went to Japan, tested all his classmates, tested him again, tested his father, tested his mother, tested his siblings. It turns out that his classmate, I mean, if you spoke to him, you wouldn't know that he wasn't a fluent English speaker. He was a fluent English speaker. He was as good as me, if not better. But his classmates, of course, would, just learn English at school. So they weren't very good. But their reading of English was better than his. His siblings were normal English readers. His father, who was a famous journalist, well, I won't say who.
Why can't you say who?
I don't want to say who.
Okay.
All right?
Okay.
A famous English journalist who worked for a famous English publication, then for other things. He was an excellent reader, but he didn't read normally, and we think he was dyslexic as well. And when we asked him, he said, I had trouble reading at school. So I said, well, why did you become a journalist in that case? And he said, I really wanted to be a journalist. So, he put the hours in and became actually a very famous journalist. So, dyslexia, we've worked on dyslexia. We know quite a bit about it. But dyscalculia is different, because there are varieties of dyslexia, but there's only really one type of developmental dyscalculia.
Does that have to do with the the kind of fundamental, simple accumulator mechanism that underlies our counting and then therefore numerical ability?
That's the claim of the book, yes. And so we're the only species that has proper language. I think it's fair to say that. I mean, lots of other, of course, all creatures communicate to some extent, but they don't have language in the sense that we have language. And therefore, there isn't really an animal model of language. Whereas, as I point out in the book, there are lots of creatures, maybe all creatures, have some degree of numerical ability. And so there are animal models for numerical ability. And the claim in the book is that what underlies the numerical ability of ants or birds or fish also underpins our own numerical ability. Now, of course, we have lots of other things that help us, like we have counting words, and we have symbols, and we have education, which fish, even though they live in schools, don't actually have any education.
So when I guess let's talk a little bit about the relation between language and counting. I've had this, I don't know if this is a common thing. You can tell me. I will often be walking and then notice around sometimes it's in the 30s, sometimes it's in the 20s, that I've subconsciously been counting my steps. It happens a lot, especially on stairs for some reason. But those are counting words. So that's my language ability on top of some counting ability. So what's going on there? And but you've already alluded to the fact that our counting ability, that very basic mechanism, is distinct from many, if not all, of our other higher cognitive functions, like language. Although in the case I just described, that's an interaction between language and counting.
Yes, well, one of the things that modern humans learn in the course of growing up are counting words. Now, it's not clear when humans started to have counting words. Now, we know that 30,000 years ago, humans counted because we've got marks on bones and stones and cave walls, which are, in my view, correctly interpreted as counting. Now, whether they actually had counting words like 1, 2, 3 to go with those marks is not certain. Now, there is a school of thought, some modelling that's been done, particularly by Mark Pagel and his colleagues at Reading University, which suggests that you can actually get a sense of when humans started to use counting words. So if you've got you can see how words change over time, over historical time, because they're written down. So you've got a record and a timestamp for quite a lot of words. And you can tell how quickly or how slowly words change. And one of the things that Pagel and his colleagues discovered is that in 3 of the largest language families, Austronesian, African languages and Indo-European languages, counting words are among the slowest changing. And so if you kind of retrodict or predict back from the oldest examples you've got, you can say, well, maybe even 30,000 years ago, humans had counting words. We don't know for certain, of course, but that's plausible. Now, but even before then, with Neanderthals, they also probably counted, looking at the kind of artifacts they made and the marks that they made on cave walls and bone. They probably counted as well. And, well, they almost certainly did, according to me. But whether they had counting words to do it, it's not clear, because we don't really know whether they had something like modern language as such. Now, why you should count your steps? The question I would then be tempted to ask is, when you were with your parents, did they count steps with you? I know that with my kids, we would walk along the road, we'd swing them along between, the mother and the father, and go, 1, 2, 3 up, and we'd count the steps up the stairs. So they got quite a lot of experience of counting words when they were very young. And that maybe stick in the mind. So later on, it gets, if you like, remembered or reconstructed. And it's commonly assumed, and there's a lot of evidence for this, though no, I think, proper research, that when you do, if you're multilingual, are you multilingual?
No, I'm not fluent in any other languages.
Okay. So if, for example, you're brought up, let's say, just bilingual, say English and French, then if you were taught counting in English, you would count in English preferentially your whole life. We did a bit of work in Spain with looking at kids brought up speaking in Catalonia, kids speaking Spanish and speaking Catalan. And some of them went to Catalan schools, some of them went to Spanish schools, and on the whole, the ones who went to Catalan schools counted in Catalan, and those in Spanish schools counted in Spanish. And we know lots of very, very educated Europeans, say brought up in Italy, speak perfect English. They count in Italian, and something that if you get it into children's brains early enough, it kind of stays there.
What seems like such a useless thing. Every time I notice that I'm, in the 30s or something, I think, because having read your book, I think I'm not an ant, so I don't need to count my steps. So what, what a waste of brain energy, essentially. Yes.
Yeah, I'm sure there's no point to it. But you never know. I mean, you might like the ants be making an estimate of how far you've gone by the number of steps you've counted, which is what at least one species of ant does.
So blame my parents is what you're saying.
Well, yeah, for so many things we should blame our parents. But I mean, the other thing is that we've I think I reported briefly about this in the book. We've actually done studies, and other people have as well, that you count unconsciously without words. Mm-hmm. So you can present an array of dots, and you mask them very quickly after their presentation. So if you ask the subject, how many dots did you see, they can't answer because it hasn't kind of registered in their consciousness. But nevertheless, we know that it has an effect on something that they do next. So if they see 4 dots and then they can't report how many there are, and then you ask them to count some dots that they can see, then if for example, the number of dots is the same in their unconscious perception, then they'll be quicker. We had some kind of strange results there, but lots of people have found that you can count unconsciously, and you can't, of course, ask people how many things you saw because they're unconscious, but you can see the effect of having made that numerical assessment on later behavior. So you don't have to do it with words, you can do it in other ways.
Sticking with words and language, just for another minute, I took a class that was interesting about the origins of writing, not the origins of language per se, but the professor focused a lot on early cuneiform and marks on clay tablets back in the Fertile Crescent, and how the need to keep track of how many sheep you get and how many I get and things like that, and those marks that you were talking about on the clay tablets, probably, I don't know what the current hypothesis is, but her idea was that that sort of thing led to written language. And of course, that's not spoken language, but so thinking about the counting abilities of us and what seems to be just across all species so far that have been tested, it seems, would you, and however, we were just alluding to the fact that language seems to be separate from this counting mechanism. So in your thoughts, counting and numerical ability must have preceded language perhaps, but do you think that it had anything to do with development of language in the human species?
Well, according to Chomsky and his followers, our ability to count is really consequential upon our ability to do syntax, linguistic syntax. And the reason for this is because we can count as high as we like, and at least we can with words. And so, if you're going to count as high as you like without words, it's going to be a bit difficult.
Yeah.
So he thinks that the recursive mechanism that you need for syntax underpins our ability to count. Well, it certainly is related to our ability to count large numbers precisely. That's true. But, ants don't have language, at least these particular desert ants don't have language. No one would claim that they do. But yet they can do some quite good, I would say, recursive counting. Fish too. So I don't think he's right about that. But obviously, you can't count, let's say 213 precisely unless you've got the linguistic means to do it. I mean, you might make an estimate of, around 200, a bit more than 200, a bit less than 250, even without the language, but you can't get 213, I would say, without the language. Language, I'm not saying language isn't important. It's, I think as the mathematician A.N. Whitehead said, a good notation, makes life a whole lot easier. And we now have a good notation for numbers. And actually one of the things that, I've just been writing about, and I mentioned it briefly in the book, is that if you look at people who are exceptional calculators, I mean, not like me, but, really, really good.
Like savants?
well, like savants, but they're not idiot savants. They're professional mathematicians, some of them, and or engineers. Anybody who's really been very good at this. And some of them have even, been formally tested and been in brain scanners and so on. One of the things that is clear from these people is that they've got an enormous memory store of facts that they've learned for whatever reason. Facts about numbers, hundreds of digits of pi, the square of every number between 1 and 100. These guys are really good. And, they're absolutely not, the classic Rain Man type of savant. A lot of them are just kids who've gone to abacus training after school in India or Japan or China or Taiwan, who just learned to do arithmetical calculations really, really quickly. Now, I don't think they're using words, by the way. The ones I've spoken to about this, the ones I've observed, they have a calculating. They have the abacus in their head, so they're not doing words. They're just moving these imaginary beads around in their head. So that's why some of them, just who've been to abacus jukus, are really good. But the other thing I would say is that all the other prodigious calculators who haven't been to abacus school, they depend on our positional notation. And my guess is that no Greek, no ancient Roman was a prodigious calculator because their notation was inappropriate for calculation. And we know this, it was inappropriate, because when people were writing Roman numerals back in the day, if they were doing calculations, they used a counting board with units, and tens and hundreds on the counting board, and they put beads on each of these columns to indicate how many tens, how many units, how many hundreds there were. So you needed a proper notation if you're going to be really good at this. Now, there were other ways. I'm sorry I've gone into this, but
no, please.
tempted me down this path. There were also finger counting methods, and some of them were really complicated, and you could do really complicated calculations on your fingers. And whether you were using counting words or and this was before you had positional notation, whether you use counting words as well, I don't know. It's not reported. But there are a lot of kind of medieval manuscripts, like from the Venerable Bede, about how you could use each part of your finger to represent a different number, and so on and so on.
The different segments of your fingers, of each individual finger.
Yeah, that's right. And so you work out ways of doing it skillfully. Now, don't ask me to do it because I can't.
Right.
I've never been taught. But some people could, anyway. But just the final point about language and numbers is this is, if you like, crude neuroanatomy, different parts of the brain, and this wasn't discovered by us. It was discovered by a Swedish neurologist called Henschen, who did a case study, and he had a case series of over 100 patients, maybe nearer 200 patients. And what he observed was you could have disturbed numerical abilities if your parietal lobe was damaged, but preserved language, or you could have impaired language if your frontal lobe was what we now call Broca's area was damaged, but your parietal lobe was intact. So he was the first really to identify this, because both areas are damaged, and you have trouble with language and numbers, and of course you often get that. And we recapitulated some of those studies in a bit more detail and showed that he was basically right.
A lot of what you were just talking about with different calculation abilities is higher mathematically than the fundamental counting mechanism. So I wonder, what the relation is between our higher mathematical abilities and this kind of tally counter, the accumulator mechanism that you describe. And it might be worth just describing, that fundamental mechanism. And just to throw one more question at you. So what you're talking about as important for counting is in our parietal cortex. But if the counting ability is so fundamental and common across species, many species don't have a cortex, for instance. So, and I know that we don't know where in the brain it happens in many other organisms, but might there be like a more basal brain mechanism that underlies counting even in us that gets elaborated in the parietal cortex? Sorry, so many questions all at once, but there you go.
Absolutely excellent questions. What we know about counting mechanism in other animals is basically in primates like monkeys yep. particularly, and in birds. This is some brilliant work done by a German neuroscientist called Andreas Nieder. He did basically the same experiments with monkeys and birds, crows, and what he found in the crow's brain, which doesn't have a cortex, was that there were individual neurons in what's called the pallium of the crow's brain, which look very much like the individual neurons in the monkey brain, except that in the monkey brain they're in the cortex, but in the crow's brain they're in the pallium. Now, we don't know anything at the moment about the fish brain.
Okay. Wow. So what is that, a teaser?
That's a teaser. Right. So come back next year. We may have an answer for that one.
Is it zebrafish that you're working on, or the?
Yeah, we're working on zebrafish.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm going to tell you what we're doing, but but we don't have the data yet.
Great.
So yeah, I mean, this is a really good question. And when you've got, really interesting counting abilities in ants and bees who don't even have a pallium, then we're talking, deep mysteries. But then again, the analogy here, at least for me, is timing mechanisms.
Oh, yeah.
So you can find timing mechanisms in all species, from fruit flies, where they're probably best described, right up to humans. So in humans, they've got timing mechanisms in cortical structures. Of course, fruit flies don't have cortical structures, but they have that. We share genes with them, or paralogs of the same genes, and so somehow these genes build timing mechanisms, if you like, where they can. Now, look, this is getting way above my pay scale, so I'm not sure I can say much more than this. But when it comes to fish, we're looking at brains of fish, and we're doing some more experiments on the brains of fish.
Are you doing like whole brain optogenetic imaging? Is that what's going on?
Yeah,
or?
Optogenetic, exactly.
Cool.
Yeah, we're doing optogenetics with microscopes because we have to use larval zebrafish, and because they're transparent, and they do optogenetics. So when bits of the brain are active, they light up in these particular preparations, and so you can see them with a microscope. And so we know that even larval zebrafish will orient towards more objects than fewer objects, and so we just want to know how these brains light up. But as I say, come back in a year and we may have the answer.
You're not going to give us any preliminary results, even
no,
pre-print?
We don't have a preprint. No, okay. We haven't. No. I mean, this is really difficult technical work. I mean, something that's beyond my particular competence, and it's the team I work with who know how to do this. And so far, we haven't got any data. I mean, we know how to do I think we know how to do the experiment. We just have got some other experiments we have to do first, and then we can get on to this really exciting one.
You mentioned the conservation of words for numbers in our language. So it made me think, and then you were talking about timing mechanisms. I don't know if we want to come back to the relation between timing and counting, since there's overlap there. But I remember I had Dean Buonamano on the podcast a long time ago, and he makes the point that the word time is the most common noun in the English language. I can't speak to its conservation as a word, but the actual word time. So an interesting overlap there as well. But let's talk about fish a little bit more in a moment. But I still want to know, because their counting ability is much more, let's say, fundamental or lower level. But because you were talking about calculations and our ability to manipulate numbers and perform higher mathematical calculations and operations, what is the relation between that fundamental accumulator counting mechanism and our higher mathematical abilities?
Well, there's some basic arithmetic. So one of the things that my fish experimenter colleagues have done is they've arranged an experiment in which the fish can only see one other fish at a time. So the fundamental or the basic paradigm is, will the fish go to a larger shoal than a smaller shoal when it can only see each shoal one fish at a time? So it can see, let's say, 3 fish over on the left and 4 fish over on the right, but it's swimming around in between these two shoals, so it's having to actually count or add 1 to 1 to 1 on this side, and then 1 to 1 to 1 to 1 on the other side. Maybe it's doing one over here, one over there. It's not clear exactly how the fish does it, but that's adding. Mm-hmm. What about fish subtraction? Don't know about that. There's been some work with bees that suggests that bees can subtract. So that's with you just step the accumulator down 1 in order to subtract. Mm-hmm. That's not so hard. So the basic accumulator mechanism is a bit like a tally counter. This is a little machine you can buy on Amazon for about a couple of dollars, where you press a key every time there's something that you want to count. So, for example, if you want to, the example I give in my book, which is rather biblical, is counting sheep but not goats. So for every sheep you see, you press the key, and the counter accumulates another sheep. And then at the end of your count, you look at the accumulator, it says 13 sheep. So the difficult thing here is not doing the counting, which is very simple, just a lever press. It's actually deciding what object you're seeing is a sheep.
The selector. And
not a goat. What I've called the selector. And that's kind of expensive. And in neural terms, and maybe in experiential terms, you have to learn what a sheep is, what a goat is. It doesn't come naturally. It may well be that the critical categories for bees, for example, are landmarks. So the bee just identifies landmarks and counts them up. It might also count up petals on a flower to know which flowers are really going to be rich in pollen. Now, what we would do in those cases, counting landmarks and counting petals, is we could say, do they have the same number or not? So we can abstract away from the landmarks and the petals, and say, yeah, they've got there are 4 petals here. I've seen 4 landmarks. Can the bee do that? Don't know. That's for bee researchers to find out. I've tried to prompt bee researchers to look into this. Anyway, we can do it, no problem. But other animals tend to only count things that are useful, relevant for them. Now, of course, you could say that when bees are counting landmarks, they're not all counting the same landmarks every time. They're counting, 3 yew trees here and 3 oak trees there. they're not the same objects, so there has to be a degree of abstraction in landmark counting as well. Now, we don't know the extent to which bees can abstract away from landmarks. We know that they do, because in the original experiment by Lars Chitka, he had large yellow tents, so it's always the same sort of landmark, but they weren't always in the same place. So the question he asked initially was, is the bee, when it goes from the hive to the food source, using a measure of distance which doesn't involve landmarks, or is it actually counting the landmarks in order to make an assessment of distance? So he could move the tents farther apart or bring them closer together and see whether the bee was using the number of landmarks to locate the food source, or whether it was using total distance from the hive to the original food source. And what he found was that they were counting landmarks. He could have tried doing it with red tents or green tents or tents in a different shape, but he didn't do that originally. So it'd be interesting to see the extent to which bees can abstract from the set that they're enumerating.
I just had a bee expert on recently, Srinivasan, and he makes the point also. Yeah,
he did some nice work on that. Yeah.
Yeah, well, a lot of his work is with like navigation and flight control. But in a nice review he wrote about bee cognition, he talks about that bees can discern zero as well, which is pretty abstract concept. But it's fascinating to me that something that you talk about in your book also. Of course, there's a question: why do we need to count? And so that opens the whole evolutionary questions. But the idea that an organism can count some things but not other things is kind of hard to fathom, given our what we would consider superior abstraction ability, that we can apply numerosity to anything no matter what. But it makes me wonder, are there things that we can't count because they're not useful to us? Or, do we have such abstraction that we are free to count anything, But it's an interesting fact.
I think we can count anything. Not everybody can count everything. I mean, some things you need to be trained to count. So there was a famous 19th century calculator who counted the number of hairs on the tail of a horse. Now, he didn't need to do that.
No.
He just wanted to do it. Now, I don't actually know how he did it, whether he did it by kind of pulling the tail apart so he could count each one. I don't know. And there was another famous 19th century calculator. Again, people of very low educational ability, very little education at all, who counted the grains of corn that he gave to his chickens over the course of some large number of years. I think it was 40-odd thousand.
Wow.
So, what you choose to count is really, up to you. You can count your steps if you really want to.
Also useless. Yep.
Which may or may not be useful, right. But navigation's a very interesting issue, and I deal with it a bit in the book. And one of the claims I make, but maybe that's not the right way to put it. One of the, explanatory ideas that I try to use here is that, particularly for animals that migrate, and most of them do to a greater or lesser extent, they go from their hive looking for food, looking for a mate, and then coming back. So how do they calculate distance? How do they calculate direction? How do they do what sailors would call dead reckoning, where you actually calculate each step of your path, then figure out where you got to, and then where you'd have to go next, where you'd have to go back to. And the analogy that I thought about was that maybe animals have something like Google Maps in their heads. So Google Maps is just numbers. And when you ask Google Map to say, as I did just before we came on air, what's the shortest way from my house to the Bridge Theatre? Basically what Google Maps is doing, it's doing a computation over numbers. Quite a complicated computation over quite a lot of numbers. And so one possibility for navigation is that animals have something like Google Maps in their heads, all which is just numbers. Now, on Google Maps you can have additional information. You can ask it to tell you where restaurants are, where stations are, and maybe on a long journey like the Bartel Godwit which flies from Alaska to New Zealand every year and then back again, it needs to know where the restaurants are en route. I don't know whether it does stop off for a snack, but anyway, if it did, that's what it would need information to have. And again, restaurants or gas stations are just numbers in the Google database. But better than the Google Maps in some respects is that these migrating birds need to have a three-dimensional map, because they're not flying flat, they're flying up in the air. They need to know about wind speeds, wind directions, where it's best to fly, where normally you get, a good following wind, where you get a bad crosswind. They need to have a three-dimensional map that includes information about winds. So maybe they don't have everything that you find in Google Maps, but they have something like, I would say something a bit like Google Maps, with at least the relevant information coded there, somewhere in their brain. Now, birds have small brains because they've got small aerodynamic heads. But one of the things we've learned recently is that the number of neurons in the bird's brain could be greater than some of the number of neurons in even some primates, because the neurons are packed more closely together. They have to be, because you've got these small aerodynamic heads.
And birds count just about as well as primates, or if not better in some cases, right?
In some cases, they might do better. In fact, they've done Liz Brann and her team have done exactly, did an experiment with monkeys, and another team took all her stimuli and did it with birds and got almost identical results. So birds can be really pretty good at numerical tasks. Maybe not all birds, but certainly corvids, crows and ravens and so on, we've known for nearly 100 years are very good at counting. And also parrots can be pretty good. Grey parrots, like the famous grey parrot Alex, who could count and actually tell you in words how many he'd counted. So they can be pretty good, and parrots have been retested again. So these are. So the term bird brain is could even be considered a compliment,
like dyslexia now. You also talk about Clever Hans. You tell that story in the book where this was a horse that seemed to have great numerical ability, but was cleverly using other cues that were subtle. And this is, you also talk about how it's difficult to actually assess whether something is counting or whether it's using density or size or some other metric to accomplish tasks. So maybe we should bring this back to fish again, since that's the main focus and kind of what you end up with in the book. But so why do fish need to count? Why do they count? And then maybe we could talk about how to tell whether they're actually counting or using some other cues.
Well, small fish like to live in shoals because being in a shoal reduces the risk of predation. So if you're a little Freddy fish in a big shoal, when the wide-mouthed bass comes around and wants to eat some your friends, it might well miss you because it's already eaten your friends. If it's a very small shell, then it might eat your friends and you, because you can't escape from it. So being able to choose the larger shoal is important for small fish. It also helps them forage, particularly if what they're looking for are small particles of the water. So many eyes do a better job than just two eyes. The other question you ask is, how do you know they're really responding to numerosity rather than to other features of the environment? It's very difficult in real life to separate out these two things, because they normally go together. So a shoal with more fish has more fishy stuff in it. So it could be choosing on the basis of fishy stuff. And I think the short answer here is that in real life, the animal will choose whatever is the most efficient way of deciding which is more. So it won't necessarily choose the shoal with the most fish, but it will choose the shoal with the most fishiness about it, if you will, particularly if there are fish of different sizes. And remember, they're all swimming around, so it's actually difficult to count anywhere.
Yeah.
In the lab, you can control this. You can control the size of the fish, how much they swim around, and so on. And you can show that under laboratory circumstances, the fish do indeed respond to numerosity. So you can get rid of the other cues that it might be attending to, like the amount of fishiness, or which is be a combination of the actual visual area covered by the fish as it swims, and the fishes as they swim around. So you can do it in the lab. It's harder to do it in real life. I mean, there are examples where you can do it in real life. So, for example, in these wonderful experiments by Karen McComb with lions, she used a playback technique. So she could tell how many intruders there were meant to be to a lion, a pride's territory, because she would place, say, 3 loudspeakers at the edge of the pride's territory. And so it seemed as though there were 3 lions going to attack the pride and its territory. And then you could tell whether the defending lions would attack the apparent intruders, would approach the loudspeakers, or whether they would retreat. And this depended upon the calculation that the defending lions made about how many of themselves there were and how many of the intruders there seemed to be. And this, by the way, is also quite abstract, because what they're doing is they're hearing intruders and they're seeing themselves. So they're making a comparison across modalities, the number of roarers and the number of themselves, which they probably assess by vision. So yeah, you can tell they're counting them under those circumstances.
You know, there's a lot of discussion about the need for ecological validity in testing of animals' cognition, whatever the cognitive abilities are. And in a sense, you know, with these tests, you might not be necessarily addressing the fishes or the lions or whatever organisms, their Umwelt, right? Their normal, ecologically valid perception and interaction with the world. On the other hand, I don't know how much mathematical ability is innate in humans, right? Because without any education, none of us would go very far, generally in a mathematical sense. So in some sense, you know, studying our mathematical abilities is studying what we have, our potential, right, for cognition, which is an interesting question still. Is that how you view, like, when you're testing fish numerical abilities, not necessarily what they are doing or what they normally do, but their potential, what they can do?
Yeah, basically you're saying, can they count?
Well, do they count? Well, it goes back to the question of when might they count versus when might they use other cues, and so we're like pushing their counting ability essentially, right?
Yeah. So you can look at things like whether they're using density of two shoals, or whether they're using numerosity. And if they've got density and numerosity, they'll use them both. Because it's sensible. If you've got lots of fish, and they're in a small area, they're going to look denser. So you'll use that as a cue. You can also manipulate it so that you can take the same number of fish and make them more or less dense by changing the way in which the tank is arranged. And under those circumstances, when you have the same numerosity but a denser group, they'll go for the denser group. I mean, they might well have gone for the more spread out group. They might think the more spread out group is more, but actually they go for the denser group, at least in some studies. So, in real life or ecologically valid situations, I mean, they'll use what they can. And it's interesting to note that two of the leading experimenters in this area, Otto Koehler, who operated mostly before the Second World War and pioneered many of the methods we still use, he thought that animals didn't count in the wild, but could learn to count in the lab. So they had this capacity, which for some reason that I don't fully understand, he thought they didn't use in the wild. A more recent student, Hank Davis, a Canadian scientist, he thought, well, they can use counting in the wild, but only as a last resort when things like density and area moving around can't be used to make that judgment. On the other hand, in the lab, Elizabeth Brannan showed that actually animals use, given a choice between area, density, and number, animals like to use number more than they like to use these other cues. Now, that's an experiment in the lab. But it seems to me that, what you do in the lab seems applicable elsewhere. So, for example, in the lab you find that most animals will go for more food rather than less food. In the wild, given the choice, they'll go for more food rather than less food. And you can do proper experiments with free-ranging monkeys, for example, about whether free-ranging monkeys will go for more pieces of apple than fewer pieces of apple. And surprise, surprise, yes, they do go for more pieces of apple.
Interesting. Yeah.
These are free-ranging monkeys, not monkeys in the lab. You wait for them to come up to, your testing area, and then you show them bits of apple or fruit or whatever going into one bucket and rather fewer into another bucket, and stand back and see which one they go for. Mm-hmm. Well, you will not be surprised to know they go for more pieces of apple or whatever fruit seems most attractive to them at the time.
Stepping back to the brain for a moment. So your friend Randy Gallistel has this idea that numbers are symbols and they must be stored internally within the cell in something more stable, like RNA. First of all, I want to ask what you think of those ideas, because I know that you and he have had many discussions. But then, I'll ask you that first, and then we'll move on to like different mechanisms in the brain.
Randy has some quite good evidence about this. I mean, it's not. I mean, he has some evidence, and he has some very, very good theoretical arguments about why it has to be something like that within the cell. Now, again, this is a topic that is a bit above my pay scale, and I'm not really competent to make an evaluation on that. But I don't see why it shouldn't be true when you have other ways of trying to represent numerosities, for example, in neural networks,
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't really work terribly well. I mean, we've done some of this stuff ourselves, and it only really works if you kind of set up your neural network with, if you like, some innate properties. And I did this many years ago with was then the student Marco Zorzi, now of course an immensely distinguished professor running one of the best labs in Italy on numerical cognition. And I don't think he really believes this anymore. But what we did is we tried to set up these neural networks, ones which simply learned to distinguish different numerosities, and others where you kind of built in a bit of innate structure, not actual numbers, but innate structure. The ones with the our innate structures seem to work much better. They model the human various types of human behavior better. So I like, now, whether this is within a cell or whether it's, connections between neurons, I don't know. I think, time will tell. And there's no reason why it shouldn't be both. There's no reason why you shouldn't have numbers within cells and some other kind of numerical representations in the strength of the connections between cells. I don't see that these are exclusive. Yes. So that would be I think that would be my position. You can have both. But it's not really been that well modeled so far, I would say.
In neural networks, you mean, or
in neural networks? I know. I mean, I've had arguments with some of the great theorists of this, like Jeff Hinton, who thinks it can all be done in neural networks, and Randy, who thinks you actually have to do it
otherwise.
within cells. I thought, but then you have to get the stuff out of the cell and do calculations with it.
Right.
So, I think, maybe invite me back in 5 years' time, and maybe
okay. 1 year for the zebrafish results, 5 for the
for the theory. Theories are always more difficult.
But you describe in the book too. I mean, there are individual neurons that have activity correlating with a certain numerosity, for instance, and then there are obviously these accumulator type neurons as well. But part of the thing with neurons, whether it's neural networks or individual neurons, is stochasticity, right? They're somewhat random. And in cases when, let's say, in a fish trying to count the numbers in a shoal, you need to be pretty precise. So how do we reconcile the stochastic nature of neural networks? And let's say, just thinking of the individual neurons that respond to the number 5 or something, right? The numeral 5. Then we also have a grandmother cell problem where if we kill that neuron, the organism would not then be able to represent 5 unless it trained up another neuron through the accumulator. So how do we reconcile the stochastic nature and then that grandmother cell like problem with the precision needed?
Right. Well, I think there's a prior question here, which is that we have the kind of the numerosity cells that, for example, Nida has identified in monkey and bird brains. So what is it about those cells that makes them respond preferentially to 5ness? He doesn't say. Maybe we don't know yet. So it might be some Gallistellian thing going on within the cell, which makes them particularly responsive to 5ness. And the question is, and I think that in some of the stuff that some of the papers that Need has published, there isn't just one 5ness cell. There are quite a lot of 5ness cells, so it's not quite the grandmother cell problem. A cell's fairly cheap, so there's no reason why you can't have kind of lots of 5ness cells. And then they have to be connected up in some way so that, there are complicated modeling problems here.
Yeah.
So I think that's one issue. The other issue you say about the stochastic nature, well, it's been known for a long time that that with, say, accumulator type neurons or accumulator type mechanisms of any sort, you get scalar variability. That is, the amount of variance goes up with magnitude. And I mean, as long as you know that, as long as the brain knows that, it can take into account the amount of variability that might be going on. And there's a bit of evidence that some animals do in fact take account of the amount of variability that some particular mechanism is showing, and making a judgment on the basis of, well, it's very likely to be 5, but it could be something else. So I'm only going to commit so much resource to the guess that it's 5, given the amount of variability. And sometimes it looks as though there isn't very much variability, and so you're more confident in the way in which you make that you choose that action.
So, Brian, we have just a couple minutes here left, and I have, as usual, 1,000 more questions to ask you. So I will have to bring you back on in a year, and we can discuss more fish in particular, and then reach out when you have those results or you're excited to talk about it. But maybe two final questions before we say goodbye. One, do we know of any organisms that cannot count? Because you describe a ton of organisms that can, whether they show evidence of being able to. Have we discovered any that can't? Well,
the question is, have we shown that they can't count, or have we just failed to show that they can count? So there's some very nice experiments by a colleague of mine, Petrozzini, who did some work with lizards. And so she found these lizards couldn't count. Then she did a different experiment and found that they could. So you've got to, first of all, you've got to have a well-designed experiment. And then, going back to your point about ecological validity, it depends on what the lizard actually likes, and you have to find both the kind of the rigorous experimental design and an understanding of lizard psychology. So you need to be lizard experts as well. So so just going back to the point, if you fail to find evidence of counting, it may be you've done the wrong experiment. On the other hand, maybe they can't count.
So, but we have no definitive organisms yet. How about bacteria?
Yeah. Well, there are. Yeah. Well, I personally don't think bacteria can count, but I mean there are bacteria that will light up if there's enough of them together. Right.
Yeah, you describe that in the book as well. Yeah,
I describe that in the book. But there have to be millions of them, and I doubt that a single-cell organism can count to 1 million. So I could be wrong about that, but I would.
They may be using some other signal besides counting.
They could be. Yeah.
I lied. I have one more question for you. Are numbers real? Okay. What's the ontological status of mathematical entities?
Right. Yeah. Okay, you leave the easiest to last.
Yeah, that's the simplest one.
I know. So this is what Gallistel calls going down the rabbit hole. I think you have to go down the rabbit hole. Well, my view is a kind of rather simple-minded view. I mean, I know about the history of foundations of mathematics. I worked on that for a while. But my view is that numbers are, of course, abstract, that abstract objects can have no causal properties. Of course, they're abstract. They're not in the world, they're abstract. But we experience instances of these abstract concepts, and these instances do have causal properties in the world. And so we can generalize or abstract from instances of these instances in order to get an abstract conception of numbers. So I'm not a Platonist in that sense. I mean, there's one of my colleagues, Marcus Jaquinto is a philosopher at University College London, who takes this kind of view. I'm sure he would say that my presentation of it is grossly unsophisticated, but it seems to me to make sense. And there are lots of things which are abstract that we only know through their instances. Even letters, there are lots of different fonts for the letter A. You've got handwriting for A. So A as a concept, the letter A as a concept, is actually rather abstract, and what we know about it are instances of it. And the same is true for lots of things like words. You can hear words in a high voice or low voice, your voice, my voice, and some other person's voice. But they all are instances of, if you like, of the abstract word itself. Or music, you can hear, Beethoven's Fifth Symphony played on a kazoo, but it's still Beethoven's, it's still the tune, isn't it? The tune's abstract. So anyway, I don't think it's a mystery that we have knowledge of lots of abstract concepts, and numbers are just one of them.
All right, Brian. Well, what's actually real is I have to go see the year-end school play, which is, I suppose, not real. It's a real play, but not about real anyway. Now I'm getting just confused, but I enjoyed learning about the counting and numerical abilities of many of the animals that you describe, most of which we didn't even get to during our discussion, but enjoyed talking with you. Thanks for being with me.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Brain Inspired is a production of me and you. I don't do advertisements. You can support the show through Patreon for a trifling amount and get access to the full versions of all the episodes, plus bonus episodes that focus more on the cultural side but still have science. Go to braininspired.co and find the red Patreon button there. To get in touch with me, email paul@braininspired.co. The music you hear is by The New Year. Find them at thenewyear.net. Thank you for your support. See you next time.
The stare